Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to America is in the Heart, a Personal History by Carlos Bulosan. Part 1, Chapter 1. I was the first to see him coming slowly through the tall grass in the dry bottom of the river. He walked with measured steps, and when he reached the spreading mango tree that separated our land from my grandfather's, he put his bundle on the ground and sat on it, looking toward our house with the anxiety of a man who had been away from home for a long time. He was as yet unrecognizable in the early morning light, but it was evident from the way he walked that he had come a long distance. Apparently, he was not a stranger in our barrio or village, for he seemed to know where he was going and to be unhurried. I rushed out of the house and ran across the pasture where some of our animals were grazing. I headed for the rich piece of land my father was plowing. It was the season for corn, and my father, like the other farmers in our barrio, had gone to our land at early dawn to start the spring plowing. I could smell the fresh, upturned earth in the air and the bitter smoke of burning grass. The fields were dotted with men plowing and harrowing and raking weeds into the river. My father halted the carabao, or water buffalo, and bit the rope. He put his wet hands on his hips and waited patiently for me. When I reached him, I leaned against the carabao and gasped for breath. The kind animal turned his head toward me and switched the flies off his back with his long tail. "What is it, son?" asked my father, taking the rope from his mouth and tying it to the plow handle. "Why are you running like a hound so early in the morning?" "I think I saw Brother Leon," I said, hoping that I was right about the stranger who resembled my oldest brother. "I saw him coming toward our house." Father kicked the dirt off his feet and said, "Your brother Leon is still fighting in Europe. Maybe he is dead now. I have not heard from him." He took the rope again and flipped it gently and suggestively across the carabao's back. And the two of them, the patient animal and my father, walked slowly and industriously away, the sharp plow blade breaking smoothly through the rich soil between them. I ran to the tamarind at the other end of the farm and climbed quickly to its top. I looked toward the mango tree, but the stranger was no longer there. I looked around as far as my eyes could see. Then I saw him coming toward our land with slow, firm steps, stopping now and then to look at the surrounding landscape. He was coming from the direction of our house. When the carabao had reached the ditch and was trying to snatch a tuft of grass, I shouted to Father to stop and look toward the stranger. He put the rope between his teeth, but when he saw the stranger and recognized him, his mouth opened in surprise and the rope fell to the wet ground. I climbed down the tree hurriedly and ran as fast as I could across the plowed earth. My father was already talking with the stranger. I stopped suddenly when I saw my brother Leon. I had seen only his picture on this large table in our house in town. I did not know what to say now that I was seeing him for the first time. My father looked at me and his face broke into sudden gentleness. "It is your brother, son," he said, picking up the rope. "He is home now from the war." "Welcome home, soldier," I said. Leon grabbed my shoulders and swung me swiftly above his head. Then he put me back on the ground and looked blank for a moment. Suddenly, with an affectionate glance at the animal, he took the rope from my father and started plowing the common earth that had fed our family for generations. That was how I met my brother, who had gone to fight a strange war in Europe. The sudden, sweeping years that later came to my life and pushed me into the unknown, the vital, negative years of hard work and bitter trials oftentimes resurrected his face for me with great vividness. And at other times, I was to go back again and again to this moment for an assurance of righteous anger against the crushing terror that filled my life in a land far away. It was springtime when my brother Leon came back to our barrio in the little farming town of Binalonan on the island of Luzon. I must have been 5 years old at the time, but I remember vividly those first days when he stayed with us. He immediately discarded his khaki army uniform and opened the small trunk where he had put his old clothes before he went away. He followed the plow again and worked patiently with us, hoping as the weeks passed into months and the corn grew tall and ripened that we would have a good crop. But the Philippines was undergoing a radical social change. All over the archipelago, the younger generation was stirring and adapting new attitudes. And although for years the agitation for national independence had been growing, the government was actually in the hands of powerful native leaders. It was such a juicy issue that obscure men with ample education exploited it to their own advantage, thus slowly but inevitably plunging the nation into a great economic catastrophe that tore the islands from their roots and obfuscated the people's resurgence toward a broad national unity. For a time, it seemed that the younger generation, influenced by false American ideals and modes of living, had become total strangers to the older generation. In the provinces where the poor peasants lived and toiled for the rich hacienderos or landlords, the young men were stirring and rebelling against their heritage. Those who could no longer tolerate existing conditions had ventured into the new land, for the opening of the United States to them was one of the gratifying provisions of the peace treaty that culminated the Spanish-American War. At this time, we had 4 hectares of land, which were barely sufficient to keep our family from starving. We had crop rotation as an insurance against starvation, and the generosity of the soil was miraculous. In the spring, we planted corn and beans and a few rows of tobacco. We harvested our crops toward the rainy season and stored them in the granary. Then we planted rice and fattened our animals in the grassy forest at the edge of the barrio. And sometimes, when the rice was growing rapidly under the warm rains, we would go to a wedding or a christening party. Then my brother Leon met the girl who became his wife. She came from a poor family in the north, in the province of Ilocos Sur, where the peasants were overcrowded in a narrow, barren land. She came to our barrio and hired herself to one of the farmers who had more hectares of land than the others. Because she came from a thrifty and industrious people, the villagers liked her, and they tried wisely, before my brother Leon returned from the war, to bring their eligible sons to her attention. Fortunately, my brother came back before she was betrothed, and in no time, they became engaged to be married. I do not remember the exact details of my brother's marriage, but I remember my father's immediate approval and great joy. I remember how I sat on a bamboo chair in the dancing pavilion between the bride and the groom, watching the peasant boys and girls dancing in bare feet. It must have been the third day of the wedding, because the women in the kitchen were already putting away the plates and the large wooden bowls used as rice receptacles on the long dining table. The men were moving away the chairs, piling them into ox carts and sleds, and giving them back to the people from whom they had been borrowed. The merrymakers who had sat at the tables earlier that day eating rice with their bare hands and washing their mouths in a large bowl that was passed around the tables, were scattering in the yard and waiting for the momentous hour of the wedding. It was the time for the groom to carry his bride to the new house which had been built especially for them in the yard, near the little grass hut where my father and I lived. He would then find out if his wife were virginal. When I was growing up in the barrio of Mangusmana, this primitive custom was still prevalent. Although in the town of Binalonan itself, of which our barrio was merely a part, it had never existed. The custom had come down to the peasants in the valleys from the hill people who had intermarried with the villagers and had imposed their own traditions. The ritual was very simple. It was also the most dramatic of the series of colorful wedding events. My brother Leon carried his wife across the harvested fields to their new home. We followed, shouting with joy and throwing rice upon them. We stopped in the yard when they entered the house. Then we waited silently, anxious to see the black smoke come out of the house, for it would mean that the bride was a virgin. If no smoke showed, he would know that the groom had been deceived, and we would justify his action if he returned the girl to her people. It was a cruel custom, because the women could no longer marry when they were returned to their parents, and would be looked upon with abhorrence and would be ostracized. But it was a fast-dying custom, in line with other backward customs in the Philippines, yielding to the new ways of the younger generation that were shaping out sharply from the growing industrialism. I do not think the smoke came out of the house where my brother and his bride were alone, because I remember the crowd milling around my father and rushing into the house. The men brought the girl out and tied her to a guava tree. The angry women spat in her eyes and tore off her clothes, calling her obscene names. When one of the men rushed out of the tool shed with a horsewhip, my father frantically fought his way through the crowd. He had hardly reached the girl when a man knocked him down, and he was trampled upon by angry feet. The men must also have knocked down my brother Leon in the house. I saw him staggering toward his bride with blood on his face. He flung himself upon her, covering her bleeding body with his, and the stones and sticks fell upon him mercilessly. Then they tied him to the trees beside his bride, and the angry peasants, who had been his good friends and neighbors a moment ago, began throwing stones at them. My father crawled on his knees and flung himself upon my brother and his bride. "Stop, you devils!" he shouted helplessly. "She is a good, industrious woman, and my son wants to live with her." But the whips began falling upon him. A deep gash was cut across his face, and blood came out of his mouth. I could no longer hear what he was saying. The shouting became deafening, and the cries of the girl were drowned by that horrible human sound. Then the crowd went away, still angry but spent. I fumbled in the dark with the bolo or butcher knife, cutting the ropes that bound them to the guava tree. It was now far into the night, and the stars were few and far away. The sky was like a field of dying fire trees, vast and remote in the night. The girl flung her bleeding arms about my brother and wept silently. I saw my father's face searching for an answer in the earth to the unanswerable question in my brother's eyes. I will never forget how my brother lifted the girl in his arms as ceremoniously and gently as he had done that afternoon, and carried her tenderly into their house to begin a new life. Not long afterward, my brother Leon, who had already sold 1 hectare of our land, which was his share of the family property, left the barrio with his wife to live in another part of Luzon. I saw him again on my way to America, but he was then a mature man with children of his own. I had written him that I would pass through his town on my way to Manila, and had asked him if he would to stand in front of his house and wait for my bus. In those days, there was only 1 bus a day from Binalonan to the train station in the town of Dagupan. I could at least look through the window of my bus and wave goodbye to him. When my bus came to the white salt beds, I knew that I was nearing the place where my brother Leon lived. I saw the mango grove and the shining fish ponds beyond it, near the mouth of the Agno River that opens lazily into Lingayen Gulf. At the edge of the shimmering plain, standing like a huge mushroom by the highway, was my brother's grass house. My heart began to beat faster as I drew nearer. Eagerly, I leaned out of the window. Then I saw him. Then his small wife, and then his children. They were standing in front of their house. The father first, then the mother, and then the children. They waved goodbye to me, all of them, and I leaned far out the window, waving to them. It was goodbye to my brother Leon, and to the war that he had fought in a strange land. Goodbye to his silent wife and all that was magnificent in her. It was only several hours afterward that I tried to recall how many children were beside my brother. Chapter 2. When my brother Leon left the barrio immediately after the tragedy, my father went to town and came back with my brother Amado, who was attending grade school there and living with my mother and a babysitter. Amado was the youngest of my 4 brothers. He was a few years older than I, and we were the only ones left to help my father on the farm. My older brothers had already gone to other towns, striking into the dark unknown for the sound of life. And if there was an echo there, if only for a brief moment, they came back to share it with our family. It was inspiring to sit with them, to listen to them talk of other times and lands. And I knew that if there was one redeeming quality in our poverty, it was this boundless affinity for each other, this humanity that grew in each of us, as boundless as this green earth. Luciano, who was next to my brother Leon, was in Camp Stotzenberg, completing his 3-year service in the Philippine Scouts, a native detachment of the United States Army. Macario, who was next to him, was a student at the high school in Lingayen, the capital of the province of Pangasinan. It was for Macario that we were all working so hard so that he could come back to Binalonan to teach school and perhaps to help us support our large family. And now it was Amado's job, when plowing time came, to follow my father with a bamboo harrow until the land was cleared, leveled, and ready for planting. I did the cooking and other simple chores in the house. The work on the farm was heavy, and every hand was needed until the harvest was over. But there were gratifying compensations in the depth of my childhood. At sundown, my father told me to take our animals into the corral. It was a clear evening, and he wanted to work with my brother into the night. At sundown, my father told me to take our animals into the corral. It was a clear evening, and he wanted to work with my brother into the night. I pulled our carabaos and goats from their pegs in the pasture and drove them to our house. I hitched a little bamboo sled to the largest goat and went to the village well with 3 empty petroleum cans. Many people were waiting to fill their earthen drinking jars or to water their working animals. When my time came, I lowered the wooden bucket into the deep well and tied the end of the rope to a papaya tree. Then I pulled it up slowly and laboriously to the mouth of the well and poured the water carefully into the cans. Before the cans were full, many people had arrived and were waiting for their turn. I walked ahead of the docile goat, and it followed me obediently to our house. I filled the water trough in the corral, and the animals stopped chewing the dry rice stalks. They came anxiously to the trough and plunged their muzzles into the water, their throats making gulping noises as the cold water thundered into their stomachs. I carried the remaining can of water into the house and filled the earthen drinking jars on the makeshift stand by the wall. The night came at last, and darkness filled the house. Except for the tiny needles of light that filtered through the walls from the sky, there was no other illumination. I found the small oil lamp where my father kept it in the bamboo rack under the homemade pillows. I lighted it and went to the kitchen. There was no food left. I went to the rice bin and filled the cooking pot. I prepared string beans and mixed them with small slices of beef. When the pot began to bubble on the roaring stove, I heard my father and brother coming noisily through the gate with their implements. They went to the water trough to wash their feet and hands. Then they came into the house and asked me if dinner was ready. We sat on the floor and ate in the twilight with our bare hands. We spread the salted fish on the steaming rice and soaked it with the broth from the vegetable pot. When we finished eating, my father started washing the polished coconut shells which had been our plates and drinking cups for many generations. I went outside the house to feed our dog with cold rice. Amado followed and watched me out of habit. Then my father came out also and sat on a long log under the eaves. Then we talked about our farm for hours, centering our thoughts around my brother Macario, who was our pride and the star of all our hope. When midnight came, we went to bed because we would have to be up early in the morning. The sun shone generously, and the corn grew tall and ripened fast as the spring passed into the rainy season. My father hitched the cart to the carabao and drove through the stony village road to our land. Amado, who had gone there before sunrise, was waiting with a huge pile of corn he had harvested. After I had driven our animals into the pasture, I followed them with a bamboo tube of drinking water. A slight rain had begun to fall upon the corn, and far in the eastern horizon above the Cordilleras mountains was a gigantic rainbow whose brilliance leaped across the sky for hundreds of kilometers. But as long as it was there to prevent the heavy rain from coming to our land, from soaking and destroying the ripe corn, we knew that we would have time enough to harvest it. My father cupped his hands and put them on his mouth, and the voice that called for me was disturbed and sounded far away. I was still a kilometer from our land, but I could hear his voice rolling down the valley. It was familiar and unforgettable, like the trees that whispered as I ran eagerly toward them. Then I saw them working furiously between the long rows, running from one end to the other with large ears of unhusked corn and making a pile near the empty cart. I put my straw hat on the horns of the carabao and rushed to their aid. Then the three of us worked furiously, looking now and then toward the east to see if the rainbow was still there. But in our hearts we knew that it was only a matter of hours before the heavy rain would come. My father had rolled up his cotton pants to his thighs. Amado was hatless and bare to the waist. He threw the ears of corn between the rows, ripping the long stalks like a wild animal. I could see his black head appearing and disappearing in the sunlight. There were 3 hectares of corn, and we could not afford to lose any of it. In the early afternoon, working on the last hectare, my father looked toward the east only to discover that the rainbow had vanished. There was a thin trace of color in the sky. We knew that the heavy, dangerous rain was on its way to our village, so we worked desperately with a hope that we might save everything. Amado jumped into the cart, which I had filled with harvested corn, and went flying down the road to our house. He came back and, calling me to help him, looked unhappily toward the east, where a dark rain was approaching. We tried to save every ear of corn, but the first cold rain came while we were working on the last row. Amado came back again with the empty cart. The corn was already wet and spoiled, but my father thought we could give it to the animals. The rain was so thick and heavy that we could scarcely see what we were doing. The irrigation ditch broke loose and the water thundered toward the cornlands. We jumped into the cart and watched the green stalks falling into the water. My brother expertly jerked the rope that was attached to the nose of the carabao, and the animal, familiar with the routine, shook his short legs and moved slowly toward our house. Then we could hear the banks of the river falling, dragging down boulders and dead trunks of trees. "Binalonan will be flooded tonight," my father said. "The rice in Binalonan will be destroyed tonight." "Do you think so, father?" Amado said, but he knew that my father had spoken wisely. Amado was only making conversation. In the morning, news came to the village that the rice fields in Binalonan were flooded. My mother and the rest of our family were living there, but we had no property in Binalonan except a little wooden house. The sun came out again in the month of September, and we put the strong ears of corn in the yard. The rice was now nearly a foot high above the water, and our animals were fattening in the grazing land. It was the beginning of another school year, and my brother Macario, who was in Binalonan for a month's vacation, was ready to return. He needed money to continue his studies, but we had nothing to give him. He stayed on for 2 more weeks, losing that time in his studies. My father began to worry. Then one day, he went to town with the deed to our land. Popular education was spreading throughout the archipelago, and this opened up new opportunities. It was a new and democratic system brought by the American government into the Philippines, and a nation hitherto illiterate and backward was beginning to awaken. In Spanish times, education was something that belonged exclusively to the rulers and to some fortunate natives affluent enough to go to Europe. But the poor people, the peasants, were denied even the most elementary schooling. When the free education that the United States had introduced spread throughout the islands, every family who had a son pooled its resources and sent him to school. My father and mother, who could not read or write, were willing to sacrifice anything and everything to put my brother Macario through high school. We had free education, but the school was in Lingayen, the only high school in the large province of Pangasinan at this time. Going to school in Lingayen in those predatory years took plenty of money. The students paid for their room and board, and sometimes, unless they washed their clothes themselves, they paid for their laundry. My father sold 1 hectare of our land and gave the money to my brother Macario. Then we worked even harder on the farm, and sometimes we planted beans between the rows to make use of time and space. My mother also worked harder, going around the villages with a large earthen jar of salted fish and a bamboo tube of salt. The peasants had no money, but they gave my mother chickens, eggs, and beans, and these she sold in the public market for a few centavos. We had deprived ourselves of any form of leisure and simple luxury so that my brother could finish high school. But even then, he kept asking for more money, threatening that he would stop if we did not send him enough. The thought that he would really stop terrified us. My father went to town once more and found the moneylender who had given him 200 pesos some months before for 1 hectare of farmland. He gave my father more money and got the deed to another hectare. The stipulation was that after a certain period of time, we would pay back the money and thus retrieve the land. But in the event that we could not pay the moneylender, we automatically lost ownership of our land. Oddly enough, we were not bothered by this usurious arrangement. We were waiting for the day when my brother Macario would teach school and pay back the moneylender. All this time, my brother Amado was working industriously with us on the farm. He worked seriously because he too wanted Macario to go through high school. Amado had gone as far as the 5th grade, but although he was eager to go farther, my father stopped him. We could afford only my brother Macario's education. Now, we had only 1 hectare of land left, not enough to maintain our family. Not far from us was a wide piece of church land which had not been touched for years. The soil was rich and the vegetation that grew in it thick and lusty. My father went to the men in the church and asked them to let him clear away 5 hectares. His request was granted, and he came back to the village with a new hope. We started working when the slight rain came. We let the roots and logs float down the river. We set fire to the land and watched the flames eat the bushes. When the heavy rains came in the last days of April, we started digging out the huge roots of fallen trees. Sometimes we put a sturdy pole under the roots and heaved them slowly out of the hole. Then we put down the pole and used our bolos and axes, cutting wildly here and there until we were ready to pull the whole cluster of roots away. Then we were ready for the biggest roots. We put a sturdier pole under them and hitched it to the carabao. It was slow and painful work. The heavy rains kept beating upon us and the lightning flashed incessantly in the sky. The thunder rolled and broke like a huge drum near us. The carabao stopped pulling the rope and quivered with fright. But we worked on, rain or shine, until the work was almost done. There was now only a narrow section of the land where the big stubborn roots were firmly embedded. The other section was already as level and clean as our other land, spreading out like a rainbow toward the river. My father was plowing it, hoping that we could plant highland rice when the water receded and the soil became firm. My brother Amado and I were pulling out the remaining huge roots with our carabao. It was during these last days of our back-breaking work that Amado entered my consciousness and stayed there like a firebrand for years. We were working under heavy rain. It was getting dark and our bodies were aching with pain. The carabao we had been using stopped suddenly and refused to move. My brother jumped out of the hole and urged the animal with his mud-caked, trembling hands, shouting with controlled anger as he pushed him. Then he shouted at me to jump into the hole and to push the pole while he slapped the carabao a little. But the animal did not move. He sank slowly into the mud. Suddenly, my brother began beating the carabao with a stick. I stopped pushing the pole and jumped quickly out of the hole. The animal's hind legs collapsed weakly in the water and he sank deeper into the mud. Then my father came running towards us and, seeing the helpless animal, leaped at my brother and slapped him sharply across the face. "What are you doing to the carabao?" shouted my father, striking my brother again. Amado stepped back, and for a moment I thought the hand with the stick would strike my father. My brother raised his hand and stopped, shaking with blind fury. Then he flung the stick angrily upon the carabao and started running furiously in the direction of Binalonan. When he had gone 100 yards, he stopped and looked back at me. Then he came running back to where I was standing near the huge roots and touched my head. Then he ran away again and halted almost on the same spot where he had first stopped. He raised his dirty right hand and waved lovingly at me. "Goodbye, Alos!" he shouted. I watched him disappear behind the tall grass in the river, his bare feet pounding in the mud as the rain swallowed him. I did not know then that he was running away from the cruelty of our hard peasant life. There were tears in my eyes, but the rain washed them away. My father heard me sniffling and saw my lips quivering in anguish. "What are you crying about?" he said, rubbing the back of the carabao affectionately with his palms. I saw my brother Amado again not long afterward in Binalonan, where I had gone to live with my mother. He was then a janitor at the Presidencia, or town hall, and helping us support my brother Macario, who was still in high school. I went from house to house in the neighborhood, climbing coconut trees, out of which, if I picked 5 of the fruit, I could have 1 nut for myself. Toward the end of the day, compradores, or buyers, would come to the grove and buy all the coconuts, including my share. I would run home and give the money to my mother. She in turn would give it to Macario. But one day when it was raining, I fell from a coconut tree. I lay on the grass mat for a long time waiting for the broken bones to heal. My mother was away most of the time. My sister Irene was still a baby. She crawled on the floor when we were alone in the house. My brother Amado came home every lunchtime and prepared something for us to eat. Then he went back to work, running home again in the evening before my mother arrived. He brought home old stamps and magazines that he had picked up while sweeping the floor of the Presidencia. A year passed slowly by. In July, when school again opened, I was well enough to walk around the house. Amado came home with a big book filled with pictures and large letters. "If you learn to read this book," he said kindly, "I will take you to school with me." "I will learn to read it one day," I said boastfully. "I know you will, Alos," he said. There was something moving in the way he talked to me. His words seized my mind and nourished my life to the edge of the day. I was greatly fascinated with the idea of going to school, but did not know why, since there was no hope of my going beyond the 3rd grade. I remember Amado putting a frayed cap on my head one morning and taking me to school, along with the other children in our neighborhood who were accompanied by their parents. He had stopped going to school when my father took him to the village to help us, but he had always had a passionate desire for education, and even later, in a distant land where he was thrown to make his world, it never completely died. Chapter 3. It was now the end of my brother Macario's school year. We gave a sigh of relief. We knew that our burden would end at last. God willing, he would shoulder the responsibility of buying back our land. There was a national election that year, and the peasants went to the Presidencia to cast their ballots. My father was not a political man, but he had always considered his right to vote a great privilege. One morning, he told me to tie a rope around the neck of the white kid in the pasture. My brother Macario would be home for a few days, and we had an occasion to celebrate. It was my first opportunity to see him. I had been born in the barrio, and when I had gone to town, he had always been away. My father filled a large sack with eggplants and tomatoes and told me to take the kid. The animal followed me obediently. When we were nearing the town, my father saw a pond with many snails in it. We took off our clothes and went into the water. Gathering the slow-moving snails from the bottom of the pond, we filled our hats, which the kid carried to town, stopping now and then to kick the burden off its back. When we got home, my mother was still in the public market. We put the snails in a large earthen jar. I tied the kid to the ladder so that my mother could see it when she came home. "Let's go to town and wait for your brother, son," my father said my father. "Is he coming home today?" I asked. "Sometime this afternoon," he said. "I hope he will bring some books with him," I said. The street was filled with voters on their way to the Presidencia to cast their ballots. They carried little jugs of basi, which is a homemade drink extracted from sugar cane and seasoned with herbs and leaves. And some of them brought their food and blankets with them. My father and I stopped in the public market to see my mother. She was selling salted fish and an indescribable aggregation of vegetables under an umbrella. While my sister Irene was crawling on a blanket nearby, my mother gave me 2 centavos for a pan, a kind of bread made from rice flour, which children in my day particularly enjoyed. Then my father and I went to the plaza and sat in the shade of the kiosk, listening attentively to the band playing our national anthem and other patriotic songs. When the students from Lingayen began to arrive, we ran to the station under the large arbor tree. We sat in the coffee shop and watched every bus that stopped, but my brother Macario did not arrive. After a while, my father went to the Presidencia to cast his ballot, but before he came back, a bus full of students came along. A young man in a white cotton suit alighted from the bus and kept turning around, as though he were looking for someone. I knew he was my brother Macario because even at his age, his resemblance to my father was unmistakable. The way he carried his head slightly toward the left made me sure. But I was afraid to go up to him. I could not move from my stool. I kept watching him for fear he might disappear before my father came back. Then he saw my father coming out of the Presidencia with the old felt hat in his hand. My brother lifted his rattan suitcase and ran to meet him. They shook hands affectionately, which was uncommon because ordinarily Macario would have kissed my father's hand. But he was being educated in the American way. Then my father waved to me. It was the first time I had seen Macario, surely the most educated man in our family. He looked at me wordlessly for a moment and then passed his hand over my head. "Is this Alo's father?" he asked. "Yes, son," father said. "Well, let us go home. I will cut your long hair," said Macario to me. "Don't you ever cut your hair, brother?" I was speechless. I was ashamed to say anything. "He needs it for protection against vicious mosquitoes and flies," said my father. "It is also his shield from the sun in hot summer." "I will make a gentleman out of him," Macario said. "Wouldn't you like to be a gentleman, Alos?" I could not say anything. I walked silently between them, my brother on my left, my father on my right. They were like 2 strong walls protecting me from the attack of an unseen enemy moving into my life to give me the warm assurance of their proximity and guiding me into the future that was waiting with all its ferocity. We went to the public market, but my mother had already left. We walked eagerly to our house. Then we saw the black smoke coming out of the small kitchen window. My mother was preparing an early dinner. My father told me to run ahead and untie the kid under the ladder. My mother was boiling rice, but she came running to meet my brother at the door, uttered a few words of affection, and returned hastily to the stove. My father carried the kid on his shoulder to the bench in the kitchen and tied its legs. It was very gentle. It did not resist. While my father sharpened the bolo on a soft stone, I poured vinegar and uncooked rice into a large wooden bowl. When he struck the jugular vein with the sharp blade, I knelt on the floor and put the bowl in place. The kid jerked convulsively, moaned, stiffened, and died. The warm blood rushed out of its gurgling throat into the bowl. The night came on quickly. I could hear my father hacking at the meat in the lean-to. Once in a while, his bolo flashed in the faint lamplight. Beyond him in the backyard, I could see the weird silhouettes of the banana leaves, and above them in the light of the sky, I caught glimpses of the coconut trees moving in the wind. Then the stars shone brightly in the sky, and my mother opened the window so that the light would fill the house. After we had eaten our dinner, we went to the living room and sat around the low table. "How are you getting along with your studies, son?" asked my mother. 3 months more, and I will be through forever," said my brother, moving uneasily in his chair. "But I need 200 pesos to finish the course. That is why I am here." 200 pesos? Said my mother, rising slightly from where she sat on the floor. "You might as well ask for 2,000 pesos. "Don't you have it?" asked my brother, looking at my father and then at my mother. "Can't you do anything at all? Can't you sell some more land?" "We have only 1 hectare left, son," said my mother, trying desperately to make my brother understand our poverty with futile movements of her hands. "Can't you sell this house?" asked my brother. It was then that my father stirred in his seat and said, "We will sell the land. You can go back to school and do not worry at all. We will send you the money and you will finish your studies." My mother's hands leaped frantically from her lap to her mouth and stayed there, stifling the protest. In one fleeting instant, I saw her hands, big-veined, hard and bleeding in spots. I saw her lips tremble for a moment and the fear in her eyes. "You can go back to school and do not worry about anything," said my father again, rising to go to the kitchen for our bundles. Now, toward midnight, we were on our way to the village to work all the harder because we would have no more land. What words of great conviction were said when my father got up from his seat. I had not heard, and if I had, they were forgotten in the sudden rush of conflicting emotions. We had no more land except the narrow strip of ground where our hut stood and the lot where my father had built a house for my brother Leon and his wife. We still had the clearing, but it did not really belong to us. Most of what we raised still went to the church. According to the verbal agreement, we could raise anything, but the church would have 1/3 of it, and from the 3rd year on, we would share the crop on equal basis. The land was not for sale, so there was no hope of possessing it. There were no usury laws that we, the peasants, were the victims of large corporations and absentee landlords. When the church took part in the corruption, the consequences almost tore the Philippines from its economic roots. It was only years afterward that a definite program was adopted for the peasantry, but even then it was merely a bait tossed by politicians into the restless life of the nation. Some of my uncles were already dispossessed of their lands, so they went to the provincial government and fought for justice. But they came back to the village puzzled and defeated. It was then that one of my uncles resorted to violence and died violently, and another entered a world of crime and criminals. But my father believed in the eternal goodness of man, and only once did he almost give up his faith. Even when the usurers were closing in on us, he did not believe that he would be cheated. He was an honest, simple man who went about his work hoping for an ample reward at the end. He was also a strong man when his deep convictions were at stake. Illiterate as he was, my father had an instinct for the truth. It was this inborn quality, common among peasants, that had kept him going in a country rapidly changing to new conditions and ideals. One summer day, when the rice lay golden in the sun, startling rumors came to Mangusmana. The peasants in a province to the south of us had revolted against their landlords. There the peasants had been the victims of ruthless exploitation for years, dating back to the 18th century when Spanish colonizers instituted severe restrictive measures in order to impoverish the natives. So from then on, the peasants became poorer each year and the landlords became richer at every harvest time. And the better part of it was that the landlord was always away, sometimes merely a name on a piece of paper. The peasants did not know whom they should present their grievances or whom to fight when the cancer of exploitation became intolerable. They became cynical about the national government and the few powerful Filipinos of foreign extraction who were squeezing a fat livelihood out of it. They began to think for themselves and to take matters into their own hands, and they resorted to anarchistic methods. But there came a time when an intelligent campaign for revolt was started, with the positive influences of peasants' revolts in other lands. With the positive influences of peasant revolts in other lands, and the Philippine peasants came out with their demands, ready to destroy every force that had taken from them their inherited lands. The unorganized revolt in the southern province ended in tragedy. The peasants were shot down and those who survived were thrown into medieval dungeons. But these conditions could not go on for long without disastrously rocking the very foundations of Philippine life. These sporadic revolts and uprisings unquestionably indicated the malignant cancer that was eating away the nation's future security and negatively influencing the growth of the Philippines from a backward and undeveloped agricultural land into a gigantic industrial country. The wealth that was not already in the power of the large corporations, banks, and the church was beginning to flow into the vaults of new corporations. Banks, and other groups. As bloodily as this wealth concentrated into the hands of the new companies, as swiftly did the peasants and workers become poorer. But some were favored by the sudden upsurge of industry. The sons of the professional classes studied law and went to the provinces, victimizing their own people and enriching themselves at the expense of the nation. In a few years, these lawyers were elected to the national government, and once secure in their positions and connections, they also took part in the merciless exploitation of the peasantry and the new class of dispossessed peasants who were working in the factories or on the vast haciendas. These conditions could not continue forever. In every house and hut in the far-flung barrios where the common man or tao was dehumanized by absentee landlordism, where a peasant had a son who went to school through the sacrifice of his family, who came back with invigorating ideas of social equality and of equal justice before the law, there grew a great conflict that threatened to plunge the Philippines into one of its bloodiest revolutions. Such were conditions in the Philippines when my brother Macario graduated from high school and started teaching in Binalonan. Since he was an exceptionally bright student, he was appointed to teach in the 6th grade at a monthly salary of 50 pesos. His salary, which amounted to $25, was the highest in our town and therefore the most enviable. Now, my father began to feel at ease despite the fact that we had no more land of our own. The plow became lighter, and he followed it gaily through the water and under the stifling heat of the summer sun. The nights became more peaceful, and the days of labor shorter and more promising. The burden was off his shoulders at last, and now he could relax for the first time in his life. I remember this period of my childhood vividly because it was the only time that my father and I went hunting together. It was spring, and the grass in the plain was young and as green as the pine trees on the mountains were. It was spring, and the grass in the plain was young and as green as the pine trees on the mountains where we were going with our dog and a week's provision of rice. As we walked through the stony village road, I could see the tall talahib grass with its crown of white flowers spreading majestically on the ditches and the soft wind-swept kogon grass parting beautifully as the breeze came blowing, as though it were a wave pushed seaward by a gentle inland wind. The murmuring sound sang through the thin, long blades, stopping our dog in its tracks with a puzzled look in its eyes. When we reached the stony bottom of the river at the edge of the Mangusmana, I saw my face in the clear, cool water that stood like a pool of light between two boulders. My father took off his clothes and plunged in. Psh! The dog followed him, whimpering in the sudden cold of the spring water. I took off my clothes also and crept slowly to the edge of the pool, holding onto the boulders as I submerged myself. We sat in the fine sand at the bottom of the pool and played with the little fishes that emerged from the crevices between the stones. It was clear and quiet in the water, and we sat side by side as though we were sitting in the sun. I will never forget the kilins, or mountain bamboo, that we saw on the way up the trail, and how my father made tubes from the young shoots and filled them with shrimps. As soon as we had made a camp, I built a fire between two large stones. My father wrapped the bamboo tubes with banana leaves and put them under the fire. "This is called daoyan. This is called doayan, son," said my father, pushing the burning coals over the tubes. "It is more delicious than the wild boar." "How did you learn to make it, father?" I asked. "From the Igorots in the mountains of Baguio," he said. "I lived with them when the revolution was broken in southern Luzon. I fought with them, and we were called guerrillas. Someday you will understand, and maybe when you grow up, you will see my Igorot friends." To this distant day, I know that my father was right about the doayan. I remember that we caught one alingo, or wild boar, and tried its meat, but it was not as palatable as the doayan. I also remember that we caught a little deer and took it back with us to Mangusmana. I tried to feed it with tender tamarind leaves and marunggay flowers, but it refused to eat anything. And our dog would stand for hours facing the wild animal. Finally, it became too weak to stand. I have forgotten now what happened to it. Some weeks after our hunting trip, a man came from nowhere to our house and presented my father with a paper purportedly signed by the church people. Because my father could not read the document and there was no man in the village who could read it, he went to town and let my brother Macario explain it to him. It was midnight when he came back to Mangusmana. I heard him come into the hut, stopping at the door to locate me in the dark. Then he sat on the bench by the window for a long time. I could not see him in the dark, but knew that he was looking out of the window toward our clearing. When the moon came out at dawn, my father awakened me. We went outside and walked side by side to the clearing. There were crickets everywhere in the fields. I remember their tiny chirping and the fine moonlight that was streaming like a flood of silk as far as the eyes could see. Walking with my father in the moonlight was as peaceful as sitting with him in the bottom of the clear mountain pool. When we arrived at the clearing, the quails were singing their mating songs between the growing rows of corn. The long, broad leaves were like human arms upraised to heaven in gentle supplication, moving slowly with the night breeze toward the west, as though they were making the sign of the cross and bowing to the wet earth in reverence. "We will have a good crop this year, Father," I said. "It is not our plantation anymore, son," said my father, touching the leaves with the gentleness that he showed toward plants and animals. "It belongs to a man in Manila now. We will have to look for another land tomorrow." I could not understand why. "You mean the land does not belong to us anymore?" I asked. "The land never did belong to us," said my father. "It belonged to the church. But now it belongs to a rich man in Manila." "What about our corn?" I asked. "They paid me for the corn, son," said my father. "But it is not enough to cover the seeds we have used. I accepted it because they told me that I had no right to plant corn in a land that did not belong to me." I did not ask my father again about the agreement between him and the church. It was only 15 months since we had cleared the land, and we had had a good crop of highland rice. And now we were expecting a good crop of corn. But a strange man appeared from nowhere and claimed that the land belonged to another man in Manila. This incident was actually the beginning of my father's struggle to hold on to the land he knew so well, fighting to the end and dying on it like a peasant. When the clearing was finally taken away from us, my father went to town several times and consulted with my brother Macario on how to get it back. There was nothing he could do. Even my brother was desperate because we had no more land left. He had been at his job 3 months now, but had saved only about 100 pesos. It was not enough for a first payment on what we owed the money lender. In the month of August of that year, when the provincial government was in session, my father filled a sack with rice and fresh vegetables and walked to Lingayen to fight for the repossession of our land. 3 weeks later, he came back to Binalonan, a defeated man. Lingayen was about 50 kilometers away, and when he came back on foot, which was the way he had gone, his feet were bleeding from walking on the rough and stony road. He walked about in great agony, but he went around asking farmers to lend him some land to cultivate.